Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this first of my Advanced Fighting Fantasy reviews, I'm going to be reviewing Advanced Fighting Fantasy 2nd Edition by Graham Botley, based on the original Advanced Fighting Fantasy books by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. Excuse me. The book is 173 pages and is priced at $29.99. That's US dollars, and I believe that's approximately 18 British pounds. The dice mechanic involves a 2d6 roll plus a stat or an ability. You have to either roll under the score to succeed if it's an uncontested roll, or over your opponent's score in a contested roll. So let's break down the book. We start off with the foreword and the intro, which gives us a potted history of the original Advanced Fighting Fantasy, published in 1989. We also have the obligatory "What is an RPG" section, although in my opinion the author has made the wise decision not to go too overboard with this, since Advanced Fighting Fantasy is a very simple system, and after all, any old RPG hands that come into the game will already know what an RPG is, and you don't want to scare off any newcomers by throwing too much at them too quickly. The intro gives a very brief but well written précis of the main dice mechanics, and then jumps straight into an introductory adventure. There are some pre-gen characters later on in the book that you can use with this, and much as I like the idea of an intro adventure and the idea that the player learns the game as you go along, I don't find the intro adventure, called The Well, all that particularly compelling, to be perfectly honest. The adventure involves the PCs climbing down a dried up wishing well and finding an unlikely dungeon crawl at the bottom of it, populated by all manner of goblins, zombies, and, bizarrely enough, some sort of cantina run by two dwarves providing food for the rest of the dungeon denizens. The adventure introduces most of the basic mechanics of the game soundly enough, and is simple enough for people new to role-playing to pick up. If you have any experience of role-playing, though, I don't see it being appealing to anybody but the most die-hard of dungeon crawlers. We then move on to Chapter 1, Character Creation, and character creation in Advanced Fighting Fantasy is done via a point-buy system, splitting a number of points between your three main stats, which are skill, stamina, and luck, and special skills such as Weapon Master, Brawling, Disguise, Bargain, etc. Players who wish to play a spellcasting type additionally have to spend points on a fourth stat, called, unsurprisingly, Magic. And this covers their casting ability and the number of magic points that they possess. Player character race, human, elf, or dwarf in the core book, gives a small stat modifier, and special skills represent more specialized skills rather than a more general level of competence, and a comprehensive list covering most fantasy-based RPG scenarios is provided. Every starting hero also gets to choose a single talent, which is some sort of special ability. I suppose the equivalent would be a feat in something like Dungeons and Dragons, and this can be things like ambidextrous, blessed, arcane, etc. Dwarves and elves also get the dark seeing talent for free, something unavailable to humans. Although this chapter has nothing astoundingly new in it or that will surprise people who are veterans of role-playing games, the character generation process is very quick indeed and offers a lot of different options without the constraints that some other more modern systems have in them, especially class-based systems. Chapter 2 is the game rules chapter, and it wastes no time laying out the core mechanics of the system. In an unopposed test, the player rolls 2d6, and in order to succeed, they must roll below their attribute, normally skill, plus a special skill if appropriate. For example, climbing a tree, you might have to roll below a hero's skill plus climb special skill. In an opposed test, the player and the opponent roll 2d6 and add their skill plus any levels in an appropriate special skill, and the person with the highest total wins the opposed test. Failing that, a hero may test their luck in order to get a lucky break. but luck is a very finite commodity, and succeed or fail, making a luck test means that your current luck score decreases by 1. Luck doesn't recover over time automatically like skill and stamina, but only on a GM say so. And whilst I can sort of see the logic to this, it does mean that a certain level of trust is required between players and the GM for this to not massively disadvantage players who have luck-based player characters. Various forms of movement, climbing, falling, etc. are covered in the chapter, providing appropriate modifiers and damage ratings where needed. Details on the most common tests made, such as perception tests, knowledge tests, etc., are then given along with modifiers. And whilst this is all mostly common sense, it's nice to have it clearly written and laid out. At the end of the chapter, there is a page detailing awarding experience and how it can be spent. Chapter 3 covers combat, which in Advanced Fighting Fantasy is basically an opposed roll with the winner inflicting damage. Now, damage works in a slightly strange way. You roll 1d6 and then look up the appropriately numbered entry on the table corresponding to your weapon, and it tells you how many points of damage you've done. Your opponent then does likewise on a table corresponding to their armor type, if any, and to see how much damage their armor has stopped. Whilst this seems slightly clunky and strange at first, it actually works quite well in play, since you copy the entries for the short table, and it is very short, for your weapons and armor onto your character sheet, and it becomes second nature after a while. I do have doubts, however, about how well it will work in a larger scale combat, though. I do expect it to slow things down a little. Characters reduced to 0 stamina fall unconscious and then start losing 1 luck point per 6 combat rounds, about a minute. When their luck equals 0, then they are considered dead. Characters reduced to -4 stamina are straight out dead. If a player rolls double 6, then they automatically win the combat round and inflict double damage with a critical hit. Rolling a double 1, however, results in a fumble. You automatically lose the round and you roll on a fumble table, which can result in you hitting an ally, dropping your weapon, or numerous other unfortunate events. The descriptions of various weapons and armor follow on from this. They're all very short and to the point. The chapter rounds off with a short section on healing and injury, which repeats the rules on dying and also provides guidelines for first aid and natural healing. Chapter 4 covers magic. In Advanced Fighting Fantasy, an arcane-minded character's magic score determines both the stat that they roll against to successfully cast a spell and the number of magic points that they possess. This is equal to double their magic point plus whatever magic using special ability they have, and these points are spent as spells are cast. Casting spells functions very similarly to the core test mechanic. However, if a player rolls a double 6 when casting a spell, they have failed and must roll on the magical oops table, which is a holdover from the original Advanced Fighting Fantasy that can have the caster turn into a toad or an orc materialize nearby, to name just 2 of the possibilities. The chapter then lists the main 2 schools of arcane practitioners in the game: wizardry, where you draw energy from unseen arcane forces in the world, and sorcery, where the magic user knows far more spells, but they are powered by his own life force. The spells are listed in terms of how many magic points they cost to cast, and are an interesting mix of utilitarian spells, fear, darkness, firebolt, etc., and truly odd spells such as glowing eyes, where you can cause your eyes to glow in a light colour of your choice, arrow snake, where a notched arrow transforms into a hissing deadly serpent, and jig, where you can cause someone to dance uncontrollably, just to name a few of the more oddball spells. The chapter is solidly written and there are some very interesting spells, although the esoteric mixture does hint at the haphazard way that the lore has built up over the original Fighting Fantasy game line. My personal favourite part of this chapter is minor magic, small cantrips that are very easy to cast and that only cost you magic points if you fail. They do only have minor effects such as drying out a wet item, creating a small flame, or making a small visual illusion, but they're great if you want to add a bit of magic to a character without going full-on wizard or sorcerer, and can be very useful in a game if used intelligently. We move on to Chapter 5, which covers religion, and it provides details on priests and the abilities they wield. They work very similarly to arcane spellcasting, requiring a magic score. However, a priest does not roll their score to make use of their abilities. Instead, the magic score represents their devotion to their deity, and in turn, how powerful the ability that deity grants them is. I think this is a great way of introducing priests that feel very different to arcane spellcasters, but without introducing a slew of new and, in my opinion, unnecessary mechanics to complicate the game. All priests have 3 common powers and 1 unique power. These are determined by the god they follow, and it's a simple but elegant way of ensuring that all priests are personalised based on the deity that they follow. A small list of powers covering things such as healing, calling on protection, shape changing, allowing for more sort of druidic style priests, and the laying of curses for all you evil priests out there follows on from this, and the chapter finishes with a short write-up of the various good and neutral deities in the setting. Unfortunately, there's no listing for evil deities in this core book, focusing on those that are likely to be of more interest to heroic types. These deities are an interesting mix of elemental and more traditional role-playing game style gods. Each grants an interesting additional power, whether it be the clerics of the goddess Throth, who can cause earthquakes, or the followers of the forge god Verlang, who can know the quality and any enchantments laid on a metal item simply by examining it. Chapter 6 is a gazetteer for the world of Titan, the default setting of the game, and it provides a very brief write-up of the world's history and a summary for each of the main continents of Alanzia, Kull, and the Old World. This chapter doesn't go into a massive amount of world detail, but it does provide enough tantalising hints that you want to know more. There is enough here to get you started, and the world of Titan is a very vast place, having been added over the years in the original Fighting Fantasy line and many fan-produced supplements and the Advanced Fighting Fantasy books since. Adding more would have easily made the book twice the size it is. A lot of this information is also available for free on the internet, on things such as the Titanica Advanced Fighting Fantasy wiki, which I'll put a link to down below. And in this section there is also a handy price list covering common provisions, transport and other items in the setting, using an exchange rate of 1 gold piece equaling 10 silver pieces. And the chapter wraps up with some handy, if brief, advice on crafting items and trading, which, although probably not likely to be the main focus of a game, are certainly sidelines that some characters may be interested in. Chapter 7 is the Director's Guidelines, and this is the GMing chapter, and it offers some very solid advice for any new GMs and some things that are worth keeping in mind for more experienced games masters. The emphasis on the chapter is very much that both the GM and the players should be enjoying the game, something that, as a GM, it's all too easy to forget, sacrificing your own enjoyment so that the players can have a good time. So I'm very, very pleased to see this enshrined as the #1 rule here. The GM section is fairly short, taking up only 4 pages of the book. However, a lot of things that other systems might include in a GM chapter have been spread out in the rest of the book, both in the main text and in the handy player tips boxes sprinkled throughout the book. The system for Advanced Fighting Fantasy is really very simple, and so the GM section focuses on providing a few useful pointers and some inspiration, accomplishing a fair amount in its 4 pages. Chapter 8 is Monsters and Enemies, and this chapter is a very, very trimmed down bestiary, offering a smattering of potential antagonists for the player characters. The monster stats are covered in a table at the start of the book, and each monster then gets a few lines covering their ecology and any special attacks. Whilst the monsters in this section are interesting, there isn't really much detail on them, and less than 20 monsters are offered in total. If you were going to run anything beyond the most basic of adventures, then you need to either purchase one of the Advanced Fighting Fantasy bestiaries, Out of the Pit and Beyond the Pit, to be reviewed later, or make your own. The paragraphs on how to play monsters are very short and don't really, in my opinion, offer much of value. However, they do make the very valid point that most intelligent monsters may not want to fight to the death, something that's occasionally forgotten when running RPGs. The character rounds off with some useful, but again brief, advice on designing monsters and some additional information for monsters that appear in the Out of the Pit book. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that Out of the Pit was originally designed as a book for the fighting fantasy line that later got picked up by Advanced Fighting Fantasy, hence the need for some additional clarification in this book. Chapter 9 is Adventure Ideas, and it's basically a grab bag of hooks, locations, protagonists, enemies and subplots for the aspiring GM, or director as Advanced Fighting Fantasy refers to them. These are all fairly interesting and could, with a little bit of work, spark some good adventure ideas. A random dungeon generator rounds off the chapter. The mechanics of it seem sound enough, but to be honest, I'm not a particular fan of the dungeon crawl, certainly not a random one, but it could certainly be useful as a starting point or for quick pickup games. Chapter 10 talks about identifying treasure and contains a number of random tables for generating monster loot. A smattering of enchanted items along with their rules are described here. Some of these are very interesting, such as the Crown of Atlantis that lets you breathe underwater and be untroubled by all manner of aquatic denizens, and could certainly inspire creative GMs to use them in adventures. We then move on to what is possibly one of the more interesting chapters of the book, Chapter 11, Optional Rules. It provides a slew of new rules and ideas for randomly generating PCs and creating new skills, talents, player races and other such things. These entries all seem well written and thought out, allowing the creative group and GM to expand their game far beyond the basic rules provided in this book, and I think it's a great thing that they're encouraging people to do this. There is then the appendices, which contain a blank character sheet, a number of very useful reference tables, and a glossary, which is all great information to see. So, what's my verdict on the Advanced Fighting Fantasy 2nd edition book? Well, it's hard not to be nostalgic about this book. It has that old school feel to it that is reinforced by the use of a lot of old fighting fantasy artwork in black and white throughout the book, not to mention the reuse of the original Dungeoneer cover illustration on the front in full cover. The system is very simple and quick to run, with character generation being very versatile and flexible. The hints we get about the wider world of Titan in here are very interesting, but that's really all they are, hints. If you want much more, then you'd have to buy one of the companion books, although as I said earlier, a lot of the fighting fantasy world information is available on the internet for free on such sites as the Titanica wiki. Again, there should be a link below for that. Some parts of the system seem a little bit clunky or a little bit dated, having the slightly different mechanic for opposed and unopposed checks, for instance. However, using the system soon becomes second nature, and it interferes with gameplay so little that it really is only the most minor of niggles. Overall, I would say that the only part of this book that does not improve on the original is the introductory adventure, which in my opinion was better in the original Dungeoneer book. Either way, if you are looking for a simple fantasy system with an awful lot of potential and that has a pedigree stretching very far back and that captures the feel of that original fighting fantasy game line, that feeling that you really were exploring a world that was unfettered apart from the imagination, and you never know what creature may lie around the next corner in wait for the unwary adventurer, then you really cannot go far wrong with this book, and I highly recommend it. Well, I hope if you've enjoyed that video that you'll click on like and subscribe to my channel, and if you have any comments on the video, please either put them in the comments box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Until I see you in the next video, take care and thank you very much for listening.